Good afternoon, and welcome to a panel discussion of the book, Who Gets What? The New Politics of Insecurity, published this year by Cambridge University Press. My name is Margaret Weir. I'm a professor of political science and public affairs at Brown University and co-editor of the book, along with Frances McCall Rosenbluth from Yale. Today's event is sponsored by the Stone Initiative on Inequality at Brown, which I direct along with Jim Marone. Who Gets What emerged as part of the Social Science Research Council's program on anxieties of democracy. The Social Science Research Council sponsored the research to assess the growing discontent with representative democracy and to explore its effects on institutions and policies. Our charge within that broader project was to examine questions related to inequality and redistribution. The book asks how insecurity stemming from economic shifts has undermined stable politics in the United States and Europe. One of the central themes running throughout the book is the fragmentation of long-standing solidarities that undergirded politics in the advanced democracies since World War II. These solidarities took the form of social democracies in Europe and the New Deal coalition in the United States. The book shows how fragmentation has blocked policy responses to insecurity that could help reknit social solidarities. And it also analyzes how fragmentation provides fuel to populist policies that serve to reinforce divisions and ultimately to undermine democracy. The chapters come at these issues from three perspectives. First, examining people, that is, how ideas and beliefs both affect and are affected by inequality. Second, examining place, how does inequality become represented in spatial divides? And third, analyzing politics and policy. What is policy doing or not doing to address the growing insecurity? And then finally, what are the political challenges involved in creating broad coalitions to address inequality? Today's panelists will focus primarily on the United States, where not only is economic inequality much higher than in Europe, but economic divisions are cross-cut by racial and ethnic differences. Social and economic policy supports are much weaker, and the very wealthy exercise an outsized effect on politics. So our panelists today are Kris-Stella Trump, Douglas Massey, Andreas Wiedemann, and Jacob Hacker. I will introduce each of them before their presentation. Each panelist will speak for about 15 minutes. We will answer questions at the end of the presentation, so please post any questions in the Q&A. So to start off, I'm pleased to introduce Kris-Stella Trump. Kris-Stella is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Memphis. Kris-Stella got her PhD at Harvard University and specializes in public opinion, attitudes towards income inequality, and the politics of distribution. She has published her work in a number of journals, including the Journal of Politics and the British Journal of Political Science. Her talk today is drawn from her chapter, and it's entitled Public Opinion and Reactions to Increasing Income Inequality. So Kris-Stella, take it away.
Thank you so much, Margaret. All right, so as Margaret mentioned, the first part of this book is about people, and that's what I will be talking about. And from among the challenges that she discussed, my chapter focuses specifically to how American public opinion has reacted to increases in income inequality. So to just set the stage for this, for these trends, what you can see here is a contrast between changes over time in the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality, and inequality in disposable incomes in the United States since the late 1970s, and then that's the purple line. And then in the blue line, average public agreement with the sentiment that government should reduce income differences. And of course, the scales are not directly comparable, but this is just to illustrate that while inequality has steadily increased, we haven't seen a reaction in public opinion to these trends. And so my chapter is an overview of the literature, looking at what do we know about why this has happened, why have we not seen increasing demand for redistribution, even though a lot of our models of public opinion would expect that we would see increased dissatisfaction, perhaps especially given that these increases in inequality have been very top heavy, in other words, really concentrated at the very top, and thus the share of the population who might benefit personally from increased redistribution is really quite large. And so I'm going to, in this short presentation, address 3 questions and kind of give my take on what I perceive the literature as saying about these questions. So first, I will ask whether this has to do with a lack of information. Is it because people don't know that inequality has increased? Then I will ask whether it has to do with fairness perceptions. And this is a broad term, but I will go get a little bit more specific about what I mean by that when I get to that question. And then I will really quickly give a kind of my take on whether this makes the US exceptional. All right. So the first question about this is, all right, so inequality has gone up, but perhaps this lack of public reaction is just because people haven't realized that this has happened. Sorry, my computer is a little bit slow. Okay, there we go. So the first question is it about a lack of information? And we know indeed that there is well, depends on where you're coming from, whether it's a problem, but it is a fact that people generally underestimate both income and wealth inequality. And this is not unique to inequality. We have similar estimation issues with numeric estimates of entities that are relevant to public policy, things like a share of immigrants or the share of government funds that gets wasted, other things like that. So when you ask people how large inequality is, using a variety of ways of asking this question, a lot of different ways have now been tried, we generally get maybe inconsistent. Generally, there's underestimation. And so this does create the question, well, perhaps it's because people don't think about inequality. Maybe they are not aware of what's happening. And this could explain the lack of reaction. And this is certainly possible. But by now we have a substantial literature that tries to address the what if question here. The what if question, of course, is if people knew, would something change? And a lot of this literature takes the form of experiments where we give people information and then see what happens. Do they actually change their mind about policy? All right. So would it matter if people knew? And so this relatively large body of literature by now essentially presents people with varying degrees of naturalness of presentation of information about inequality. There are a fair number of studies that find no impact. There are studies that find limited impact. I, in my piece, cited mostly political science and psychology pieces, but there's also a economics literature on this that I didn't delve into quite as deeply. There's a recent meta-analysis that came out after the chapter was finished from the OECD. This is the last site here, Tiani et al. And they run a meta-analysis of all the experiments they could find that do this kind of information provision. And what they find is that there's a statistically significant but small effect. In other words, giving people information does seem to increase concern about inequality more than support for policy, redistributive policy. But the effect on redistributive policy support is very small and quite consistent with something that will be almost non-observable, kind of in the wild, so to speak. So it seems that at best, giving people information has very small effects. And so we may conclude from this, and I am inclined to conclude from this, that even if people were better at giving these numeric estimates, we probably wouldn't see big changes. I'm sorry, I think my computer is going back and forth a little bit without me having complete control of this. So please bear with me on this. All right, so the next question here is, I do want to say that there's of course a broad variety of ways in which you can present this type of research, this type of information. So there are some types of information that may matter more than others. And some that I picked out from the literature, it seems that giving people information about where they are in the distribution, for example, are you in the top 10%, top 20%, maybe you're in the bottom 20%, and you may not know where you land, giving people that information may have some effect on support for redistribution. Information that also has implications for whether social mobility is as high as people think it is, or whether inequality can be changed through policy, those types of information may also matter. And now this is where I definitely editorialize, but I think that this has to do with the fact that this kind of information, rather than being abstract and quantitative, can tap into people's sense of whether the system is fair and whether it works the way that they think it should work. So numeric information can be difficult to link to these qualitative impressions of whether the system is fair, but things like you are not doing as well as you thought, or the chances for your children to move up the ladder are not as good as you thought, that type of information has a more qualitative feel to it that may then change people's opinions about policy. So that's what I think is kind of the common thread in the things that may actually matter when it comes to how we communicate this type of information about inequality. Though you'll also notice that this is, depending on how strict you are about thinking that this is inequality, you're kind of drifting away a little bit toward, for example, information about social mobility, etc. But this kind of stuff may matter. Okay. You will also notice that so far I've talked only about essentially self-interest. All of these things about qualitative sense of something is going wrong or something that I'm dissatisfied with, these have to do with how you are doing in the system. But I propose in the piece that in addition to economic self-interest or your sense of whether you have been treated fairly by the system, other types of perceptions of fairness also matter. So preferences for redistribution are informed by more than perceptions of whether your situation in the system is deserved, but also whether other people deserve their place in the system, and thus whether government should intervene to do something about it. And so the target, I think there are a couple of target groups who are very relevant here. Then stereotypes of those groups matter for how we feel about inequality. There we go. So first, I think the stereotypes of the poor matter. Of course, if you don't think that the poor deserve help from the state, you're less likely to support redistribution. And it's important here to note that especially in the United States, these stereotypes may be particularly strong because they are also attached to stereotypes of disadvantaged ethnic and racial groups. And that may make them particularly difficult to dislodge. And probably perceptions of the rich matter too. Do the rich deserve to be as rich as they are? Because if they do, then you will be less likely to support redistribution. And just the fact that income inequality has increased may not budge these stereotypes around much. So people's perceptions of the deservingness of the poor or how hard the rich have worked may actually not be directly impacted by this type of information. And I propose that it is this type of stereotypes and this type of perceptions of who deserves to be rich or poor that are actually the really big drivers of these attitudes toward government redistribution. All right. So my final question that I want to address is whether this all makes the United States exceptional. Is the lack of a reaction really unusual? And first, I want to point out that, yes, the United States, when we look at policy, is exceptional and in this extent to which its welfare state is very limited. And Andreas, and I'm sure also the other panelists, will talk about this later in this panel. We also know in public opinion, there are ways in which Americans look different. The public overestimates mobility. Of course, the US is particularly divided when it comes to ethnicity and race, including how economic divides align with those divisions. And both those things probably matter for keeping support for redistribution relatively lower in the United States than it may be in other countries. However, I think that the mechanisms that affect public opinion are the same as elsewhere. In other words, racial and ethnic heterogeneity does affect American support for redistribution, but that mechanism is the same as it is in other countries. In other words, that same heterogeneity and that same visible difference of the poor may have the same impact in other countries. Similarly, the lack of an effect of information is not unique to Americans. We observe it in other countries across the world as well. So in that sense, seen through that lens, the United States is not exceptional, exceptional because things work differently here. It's different because some of these variables are different here. And finally, I just want to point out that even in the United States, we do have a consistent majority over time who is concerned about inequality. And for that reason, it is very important to look further than public opinion when we explain persistent inequality and lack of policy responses to it, for example, to space and to policy. And with that, I hand over to the other panelists. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kris-Stella. So on to our next panelist. Our next panelist is Doug Massey. And Doug Massey is the Henry G. Bryant Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs at Princeton University. He is past president of numerous scholarly associations, including the American Sociological Association, the Population Association of America. He's an elected member of many honorary societies, including the National Academy of Sciences, and he is the author of many award-winning books, including American Apartheid, Segregation, and the Making of the Underclass. The chapter he contributed to our book is entitled America's Unequal Metropolitan Geography, and it is co-authored with Jacob Rue of the University of Utah. So with that, I turn it over to Doug Massey.
Okay, I assume everybody can see my screen. If that's not the case, somebody give me a sign. Well, we all know about what's happened with income distribution in the United States. And here's a graph that summarizes what's happened. You can see that there's been a huge increase in the share of income going to the top quintile of the income distribution. And it's really come at the expense of everybody else. So it's really taken money out of the fourth quintile, more out of the middle quintile, a lot out of the second quintile, and some out of the lowest quintile where there isn't much to begin with. And the increase in inequality has been fairly steady over the past 50 years. So this begs the question of how does this happen in a country that's theoretically a democracy, where a set of policies sustain a political economy that benefit only 20% of the population and harm 80% of the population. We know something about this from work of some of my former colleagues at Princeton and others, Larry Bartell's Unequal Democracy and Marty Gillen's Affluence and Influence, and Cook et al. Their paper on political engagement by wealthy Americans indicates that wealthy Americans are very politically engaged. They're much more politically engaged than other people. They pay more attention to politics, and politicians pay much more attention to their political views than others. They have a privileged access to the halls of power, and they have many means of influencing public policies. So the chances that policies that benefit the wealthy, the affluent, those policies are much more likely to be passed and implemented through legislation and executive actions. So I think a lot of this a lot of what's happened in the past 50 years has to do with distribution of affluence and poverty in space. Now, William Julius Wilson back in the 1980s was the first one to really call social scientists' attention to the fact that the poverty was concentrating. And this had something to do with perpetuation of what was then called the underclass, Black and Latino poverty in inner cities. And you can see that in the 1980s, the concentration poverty among Blacks was in fact increasing. So you can see this is poverty concentration for Blacks, Hispanics, and lower concentrations for Asians and whites. But that didn't continue rising, and it came down by 2010. We'll be doing analyses using the 220 data pretty soon, but what's really surprising about the past 50 years is the sustained increase in the concentration of affluence. Now, so what we see here is that the average white person in 1970 lived in a neighborhood that was 36% affluent, and by 2010, they lived in a neighborhood, a census tract that was 45% affluent. And Asians, when they come into the picture, they live under conditions of even stronger concentration of affluence, and lagging far behind at every point in time are Latinos, and blacks. So we see a pattern where the concentration of poverty for blacks and Latinos is higher than for Asians and whites, but it's not really increasing that much. But what we see as a big change is the fact that the concentration of affluence is really increasing greatly for whites and Asians, and it's really far above that of blacks and Latinos. So where are the areas of concentrated affluence in the United States? This looks at concentration of affluence from the white point of view, from an affluent white person's point of view, from an affluent black Asian person's point of view, Hispanic person's point of view, and a black person's point of view. So where are Asians and whites where are affluent Asians and whites living in neighborhoods of high affluence? You can see, well, it's on the coasts. It's in the northeastern corridor, Washington to Boston. It's in California, the Bay Area to Los Angeles and San Diego. It's in Seattle, and Portland. It's in Chicago, and it's in other Denver, Boulder area, other areas around the country, and they look very similar for Hispanic, for whites and Asians. And what you see is that it's very unlikely that an affluent white person will live in a neighborhood that's less than 20% affluent, and it's pretty much the same for Asians. When you turn to Hispanics, what you notice right away is that there are very few, much fewer places in the country where Hispanics are affluent Hispanics are able to live in predominantly affluent neighborhoods. And this, what the green here shows, is over 40%. And when you get to African Americans, it's even a sparser picture. And they're much more affluent. African Americans and Hispanics are much more likely to live in relatively unaffluent areas. So what are these areas? You saw them on the map, but they didn't actually give the absolute figures. And what we find is that in the centers of decision-making and power in the United States, that's where the affluent are most likely to be isolated in affluent neighborhoods. Washington, D.C., Washington and Bethesda, for Asians and whites, has the highest concentration of affluence anywhere in the country. So the political decision makers in the United States are likely to live in affluent neighborhoods where they're very unlikely to come into contact with even middle-class people, much less poor people. And you see the same kind of pattern for both Asians and whites. San Francisco Bay Area, the New York area, the Baltimore, New York, Boston, Hartford. Didn't mean to do that. Yeah, Boston, Cambridge, Anchorage, Seattle, Manchester. And you see that for blacks and Latinos, it's much harder for an affluent black or Latino person to live in an affluent neighborhood. These are the top 25 metropolitan areas for concentrated affluence for whites, Asians, blacks, and Hispanics. And you see that in the top 25, they're all above 50% affluent in the neighborhoods for whites and Asians. But for blacks and Latinos, that 50% cutoff occurs very quickly, and most of them don't achieve that kind of concentrated affluence, and they never achieve the high levels that we observe for whites and Asians. Now, you might think that this is stemming from an increase in the segregation of affluent from poor people, or poor people from affluent people. And when you look at this using an index of dissimilarity, you find that trends in class segregation are fairly flat. They're not increasing that much or decreasing that much, and they're fairly stable over time. We do see the typical pattern where the whites and Asians are more segregated from poor people than are blacks and Hispanics, but even then the differences aren't so great. And so we estimated a series of regression analyses to look at what predicts the segregation of affluent whites, Asians, blacks, and Hispanics from the poor of any racial or ethnic group. And what we see is that the legacy of segregation in the United States is quite strong, that black-white segregation contributes substantially to the segregation on the basis of class. So for whites, black-white segregation increases the concentration of affluence for whites. Black-white segregation increases the concentration of affluence for Asians, but it decreases the concentration of affluence for Blacks. And the Hispanic white segregation doesn't have so much of an effect on other groups, but it does substantially decrease the concentration of affluence for Hispanics. And it's also occurring in places where we have large Black and Hispanic populations. And for Blacks, a large Black population means they're much less likely to be able to achieve concentrated affluence for themselves. And that's similar for Latinos. A high Hispanic population undermines the ability of affluent Latinos to separate themselves from the poor of other groups. And see that density restrictions play a big role in segregating Blacks and increasing the concentration of, decreasing the concentration of Black affluence. Looking here at the equations predicting the concentration of affluence for whites, Blacks, and Asians. The past one was predicting racial degree of class segregation. This looks like it looks at the concentration of affluence. And you can see here that while segregation, affluent poor segregation is a big factor. And we saw in the last slide that it's predicted strongly by Black-white segregation. So that Black-white segregation contributes to class segregation, and class segregation pushes up the level of concentrated affluence. And we see here that just the sheer increase in affluence, that huge increase in the top 20% of the income distribution, that is a big factor in pushing up the concentrated affluence for all groups. So if class segregation is relatively stable between affluent and poor people, and you increase the relative share of affluent people in the population, then you're going to get more concentrated affluence. And again, you see that the presence of African Americans in a metropolitan area decreases the concentration of affluence, holding the degree of residential segregation constant. So why is this important? Well, a former student at Princeton University, Adam Thal, was in the politics department. I can't remember if he ever took a course from it, but we talked a lot about it. And he estimated he got a hold of a data set that estimated the effect of living in an area of affluent isolation. So class isolation of affluent Americans has a strong effect on their perception of social conditions. Under conditions of concentrated affluence, the affluent take on perceptions of social conditions that are way more positive than the perceptions of everyone else in society. And this leads them to the false sense that others' lives are as problem-free as their own. And in so doing, it imperils the prospects for improving social conditions in the United States. And under these circumstances, the populist backlash that carried Donald Trump to power is hardly unexpected. We also know that empathy is bred through interpersonal contact. When you see other people suffering directly, that triggers natural emotions of human empathy. But if you're separated and you never see them, that also leads to a lack of empathy for people and their problems. And motivated reasoning allows people to invent all kinds of explanations for why they're poor and why it's not their fault. So I think the class isolation of the affluent has become a characteristic feature of metropolitan America. And I think it's having a big effect on political perceptions among the affluent about what causes poverty, why it exists, why equal opportunity has become more difficult, and why social mobility rates have fallen, as Raj Chetty has shown. So I'll stop there and turn it over to the next speaker.
Great, thank you so much, Doug. Our next panelist is Andreas Wiedemann, who is an assistant professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. Andreas studies the comparative political economy of advanced democracies, focusing on financial markets, wealth inequality, and social policies. He is the author of a book that just came out this year from Cambridge University Press. entitled Indebted Societies, Credit and Welfare in Rich Democracies. His presentation is drawn from a chapter in Who Gets What entitled The Anxiety of Precarity that was written with Kathleen Thielen of MIT. So Andreas, we see your slide, but we do not see your face yet. So perhaps turn on your camera.
Oh, I have my camera on.
Okay.
Can everybody see the slides? Okay. Well, thanks again for organizing this panel. So this chapter, written together with Kath Thielen, takes a broader comparative view to basically situate a couple of the trends that we've heard about before in a comparative perspective, and tries to provide a framework to think about how risk originates and how risk spreads across different domains. And so I want to start off by highlighting three broader trends that are not unique to the United States, but you will see how they impact the US in a very particular way. So the first is a changing labor market environment. And so we see a lot of flexible work arrangements arising. The gig economy, for example, has become very prominent. New jobs, atypical forms of employment, for example, zero-hour contracts, characterize the new work environment, especially in the knowledge economy. A second trend that we identify, I think I have the same issue as Kris-Stella. A second trend that we identify is changes in the welfare state itself. And so here we have obviously welfare state retrenchment, so the fact that benefits are going to be cut or the duration period is going to be cut, but also a concept called policy drift that basically describes the way in which the welfare state is no longer updated to changing work realities. So for example, if unemployment becomes much more frequent, then a policy that is designed to or that requires that people have a longer work history will no longer provide a lot of benefits for these type of people. And so you get a mismatch between the working lives and financial realities that people experience and what the social policy framework provides in terms of benefits. And so that again leads to financial risks. And then the third element is something that has come up in the discussion about rising income inequality and wealth inequality, and that is the growing influence of finance. And so here we really think about financialization and what Colin Crouch has called privatized Keynesianism. So the idea that it's no longer the government that takes on debt to engage in deficit spending, but it's largely households, private households, who take on debt to address financial shortfalls, but also to invest in education, for example. And so the outcome of that is obviously rising levels of household indebtedness, but also growing levels of financial instability. And so what we do in this chapter is we basically put all of these things together and come up with a concept that we call risk contagion. And so that is the idea that risks arise in one domain, and those risks are amplified because of contingent risks in other domains. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples how this plays out in practice. But the outcome is that it can compound risks. And so the US is pretty unique in those on this definition, as I will show you in a second. And so the way we think about risk contagion really comes from two elements. So the first is what we call the risk sources. So where is potential risk coming from? The probability of experiencing unemployment, for example. And the second element are risk mediators. So to what extent the risk that you might experience, for example, because of unemployment, might actually manifest itself. So for example, if you have a very comprehensive welfare state, a very comprehensive unemployment insurance system, then becoming unemployed might not necessarily matter so much from a purely financial point of view because you are compensated well. Now, the consequences of risk contagion, if my slides are cooperating, are that both risk sources and risk mediators jointly shape realized risk. And so we think it's important to distinguish the probability of actually experience some kind of risk and then the potential mitigating forces that will alleviate any kind of financial impact. And so in the chapter, we talk a lot about cross-national differences in sources of risk and in medias of risk, but we also highlight that policies that are designed to either mitigate or amplify these risks in one domain differ across countries to a certain degree. So what are some examples of these risk sources? So for example, if you think about the chances of entering the labor market, this is something that has become much more difficult for a lot of people. There's a chapter in the volume that talks about skill mismatch, for example. So the way in which people are trained and the type of jobs people can get, especially for low-skilled individuals, that's a big issue. We also see rising levels of youth unemployment. It is very difficult for some people to actually enter the labor market. We also think about chances of returning to the labor market. So for example, if you had a period of leave of absence, parental leave, for example, sometimes it's very difficult for people to come back into the labor market. So that's one group of risk sources. Another one is obviously the risk during employment. So even if you have a job, you might have unstable work hours, you might have low pay or even in-work poverty. A lot of people work multiple jobs and it's still not enough. They live paycheck to paycheck. And where the US is really an outlier, as everybody probably knows, is that there's no federal policy for paid maternity leave or parental leave for that matter. And so that puts a lot of people at financial risk and at a big disadvantage. And then, of course, job loss is another big source of risk, unemployment, because that directly cuts into your earnings. Now, what are some of the risk mediators? So the most important ones that come to mind are the ones that are provided by the welfare states. You can think of your typical social insurance policies like unemployment insurance or sickness benefits, but also social investment policies. So policies that invest in education and activation policies, retraining. But there are also private risk mediators. And so here again, the US stands out in terms of private health insurance, for example. But also the use of wealth. So think about savings, especially liquid savings, but also home ownership can be a source of risk mitigation if you can borrow against your house, for example, or in general, if you have access to credit. So if you put all of these elements together, you get the following table here, which I'm going to use to illustrate how we think about this in the context of labor market. Risk. So the risk itself, so the risk of becoming unemployed, can be high or low, and then whether or not the risks are addressed either collectively, so through social policies, or whether or not the risks are borne individually. And so just to pick out two examples, if you look at Denmark or Sweden for the matter, and the United States, both of these countries, all three of them, have very flexible labor markets. So people switch jobs quite frequently. It's quite possible that become unemployed, but the financial consequences or the risk of unemployment actually translating into any kind of financial risk is quite different across these countries. So Denmark or Sweden provides fairly generous unemployment benefits, whereas US is much more stingy on that front. And so same type of individual losing their job will have very different implications in whether or not there will be realized financial risk. And so you can think about this from a country perspective, but you can also think about it from an individual group perspective within countries. So there are individuals within Germany, for example, labor market insiders who have very stable jobs, very low risk of unemployment. But there's also a group of people that work more on the fringes of the labor market, and they're much more exposed to losing their job, and they also don't get very good benefits. So we think of this as a useful framework to analyze to what extent people actually experience risks or not. And so let me give you an example of how we think risk contagion actually plays out. And this is something I think the pandemic has also brought to light. If you lose your job in a country like Denmark or Sweden, there will be an earnings loss, but that earnings loss is mitigated by a very generous welfare state. You're not at risk of losing your health insurance because there's universal healthcare coverage. And you also typically at a very low risk of financial insecurity, even if you have a lot of mortgage debt, for example, because the government provides you with a fair amount of financial security in the event of unemployment. Now, contrast that to the experience of an American who might lose their job. And so the issue here is that not only will the earnings loss not be compensated that well because unemployment insurance is typically much weaker, but you also risk losing your health insurance because health insurance in many cases is contingent on employment. And on top of that, you're also at higher risk of financial insecurity, for example, because you have to make loan payments. And if you lose your income, you might fall into arrears, face bankruptcy or foreclosure. And so you can see how becoming unemployed in one country doesn't really have much of an impact on people's financial security. But in another country like the US, it really spirals into all kind of different domains, healthcare, and financial security. You might even lose your house. And so this is what we think about when we think about risk contagion, that one negative event can really spread into different domains. And just to show you two plots of how this plays out in practice. So here is a chart that shows the survey response from the Commonwealth Fund International Health Policy Survey from 2013, where they asked individuals whether or not they experienced serious problems paying or were unable to pay medical bills in the past. And so you see the US stands out quite dramatically here, with almost a quarter of individuals saying, yes, they do face financial securities on that front. And the other countries are much lower. The United Kingdom, with the NHS is really low on that front. And then in terms of household indebtedness, for example, you see a similar picture where consumer credit in the UK, in the United States is very high. So according to this metric, around 25% of disposable income in terms of consumer credit, so credit cards, for example. Housing loans, Denmark here stands out quite a bit. And if you contrast those two things, you see that if you lose your job in the US with a very weak social policy framework, a lot of people will face credit card payments that are due every month, and they have to make payments. And it's very difficult for those people to maintain those things. Whereas a Danish person who is indebted with a big mortgage, for example, will not necessarily face this type of financial insecurity, because unemployment doesn't necessarily lead to the same type of financial difficulties, because the government provides a fair amount of benefits. And so if you put these two things together, in a country like Denmark or Sweden, for example, there's a very low risk of risk amplification, because typically social policies provide a backstop that prevent risks from one domain to spiral into another domain. But the US, and this is where the US is really unique, actually has a high degree of risk amplification. So again, in the example of unemployment, risks will quite easily spread into other domains because of a lack of social policies, but also because these private risk mitigators like access to credit or wealth can actually become its own source of insecurity. And so in the chapter, we have this radar chart here. If my slides are cooperating. Nope. And I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but basically we collected a couple of indicators that map onto these various risk dimensions that we just talked about, and basically puts them on this radar chart. And so you can see that the larger the surface area of this bizarre polygon is, the larger the risk that individuals in this country are experiencing. And so while you see that, Denmark, for example, has this little spike up there, so this is the amount of credit or debt that people have taken out, it doesn't necessarily translate into risks, as I talked about before. But the US has a pretty large surface area, indicating that across all of these domains, labor market and finance and so on, there's a fairly high risk of individuals out there, and risk will spread across these different domains very easily. Okay, so to conclude, what we point out in this chapter is that changes in labor market and changes in social policies work together and have jointly created new forms of economic precarity. So it's very easy for individuals to fall through the cracks, and that can happen, from one day to another. And this concept of risk contagion, that there's an interaction between risk sources and risk mediators, which can compound insecurity, we think is a useful framework to map out, what are the sources and what are the mitigators of risk. And the comparative perspective that we put forth in this chapter really highlights that none of these things are necessary outcomes. A lot of these things have to do with policy choices, deliberate policy choices that could be alleviated if policymakers were to choose so. And so again, you can think about risk sources and risk mediators separately. So if you were to tinker with a policy framework, labor market regulation would be one way, a universal basic income, for example, would be another way to think about how risk could be mitigated. But in general, make benefits independent of employment. I think that's a very good way to get rid of a lot of the risks that exist in the United States, but don't exist in another country. And it doesn't show up here now. Regarding the risk mitigators, typically we think that it would be best to disentangle like I said before, employment-based benefits, but also to extend coverage and make especially social insurance a little bit more generous. I mean, this is something the US has done during the pandemic, which has worked quite well. But now these policies have expired, and people still have to deal with debt levels, for example, and other forms of risks. So that's our chapter. Thank you.
Great. Wonderful, Andreas. Thank you so much. I want to remind people that you can pose a question in the Q&A, and we will address questions after our last speaker. And our final speaker, Jacob Hacker, I thought it would be good to follow Andreas's presentation about the weak social policy in the United States, and to follow, frankly, all the other presentations, because it is about the politics of this issue. So Jacob is the Stanley B. Resor Professor of Political Science and Director of the Institute for Social and Policy Studies at Yale University. Jacob is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the author of many books and articles. His most recent book, written with Paul Pierson of UC Berkeley, is Let Them Eat Tweets: How the Right Rules in an Age of Extreme Inequality. His talk today is drawn from the chapter that he co-authored with Paul Pierson in Who Gets What, and the chapter is entitled The Peculiar Politics of American Insecurity. So, Jacob.
I have to unmute. Okay. You can't hear me, but can you see my slides? Yes. Okay, great. Well, so it's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you for the kind introduction, Margaret. And more important, thank you and Francis for putting together this terrific volume and for getting together such an all-star team of fellow scholars, who have already, I think, done much of what I want to do in my chapter. So I have, I think, an enviable position. That is, as the closer, I can simply refer to what they've already said and try to pull some of the strands together, and in particular to explain why it is that American insecurity is so rampant, as Andreas and others have pointed out. So I do want to offer one more thanks, and that's to my co-author, Paul Pierson. Paul and I are longtime collaborators, and we really don't know where one's idea ends and the other idea begins. One time someone, I think it was a reviewer, said that we were Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson of political science, which we really liked, except for now we've been fighting over who gets to be Sherlock Holmes and who gets to be Dr. Watson ever since. So I wanted to start with just by saying what I do in the chapter, and then really focus on this last political side of the story. So in the chapter, I build on the work that I've done on the Great Risk Shift, as well as the writings in the chapter and by others on the erosion of America's distinctive framework of social provision. And so it's true that we've seen rising insecurity in rich democracies writ large, for reasons Andreas has said, but as he noted, right, the effects of some of these broad shifts are really acute in the United States. And I want to say just a word about why that is before I really get into the explanation of the politics and the policy, which, as Andreas ended, is really at the heart of why the US has had such a distinctive experience. And since Kris-Stella did such a great job talking about the demand side, I'll only say a word or two here, just emphasizing that I think the resonance of racial appeals in our system is much greater than it is, even if those are part of the politics of other rich democracies, much greater in the American context, and has a big impact, in particular, on the capacity of the Republican Party to hold together a particular kind of coalition, one that Paul and I call a plutocratic populist coalition in our our book, Let Them Eat Tweets, that Margaret so kindly mentioned. So that's a lot to do, but as I said, I'll be standing on the shoulder of the other giants up here. So let me start with that. So as Andreas said, the American framework is unusual in the degree to which risk pooling is really centered within the employment relationship. One stark illustration of that is if you look at the OECD data, if you look at private social spending by employers, mostly or through the employment relation, mostly health insurance and retirement pensions, if you add that into the totals for public social spending, take into account taxes, the US is the second highest spender in the world, second only to France. And that's, of course, not to say that our spending is doing the same thing that France's spending is doing. In fact, as Andreas pointed out, the American system is really eroded because employers have this central role. And while they continue to spend, they spend more and more on either benefits that are not doing as much risk pooling as they once did, or on benefits for the most privileged workers. And as Andreas said, this is really driven by what I've called policy drift, namely the failure to update policy to reflect changing circumstances. And the politics of drift is a distinctive kind of politics. It's one where organized interests that can kind of quietly block updates are advantaged, and politicians often can do things that aren't particularly popular because essentially it's hard to hold politicians accountable for inaction. And the rising polarization that I'll say more about in a moment, asymmetric polarization of parties, has made that kind of policy updating a lot harder. But I do want to emphasize, because we've talked about inequality, but we may not have stressed enough the distinctiveness of American inequality, that it's the interaction of the American framework of social protection, its erosion, and the degree to which American inequality is distinctively stark and growing that has really explained a lot of the politics and policy dynamics that I'm going to talk about. So you may have seen this figure, but I'll just show it to you. This is, of course, the famous crossing lines. The top 1% share of income has essentially doubled over the last 40 years. And the bottom 50% share of income has fallen by half. They've sort of changed places. And you're familiar with this. Less familiar to some is that Western Europe doesn't look anything like this. There's been a sort of modest rise in the share of the top 1% and a modest decline in the bottom half. And you see somewhat similar but slightly different stories when you look at wealth. But the point is just that inequality, we are the world leader in inequality, and that actually makes a big difference for how the politics and the experience of insecurity play out. So the point about race that I just want to briefly mention before I turn to the larger political story is that there is now a very large body of research, as Kris-Stella noted, and there's some that's about inequality, the kind of work she discussed. There's some on insecurity as well, including my own, that shows that people don't like being insecure when they experience large income losses or large changes in their economic circumstances. They want policy responses to that, but that hasn't really translated into a strong demand for policies to address insecurity, just as it hasn't necessarily resulted in a strong demand for policies to increase redistribution. And John Romer has a really nice way of talking about the role of race in this, because of course it's still the case that the majority of the electorate is white, and that white Americans, that many of these policies are highly racialized. And there's kind of two sides to this, according to my colleague Romer. One is this, what he calls one is what he calls, I should have gotten you to this figure. One of them he calls a kind of solidarity effect, right? You don't want to share with people who look different from you. But the other is this kind of party effect, this policy bundling effect. And that's really important for understanding how the Republican Party has managed to combine relatively unpopular social policy positions with an appeal to less affluent white voters that results in them continuing to do very well at the polls. Witness Virginia's recent election. So I'm just going to skip this next slide, but I just wanted to make that point. So the Republican Party's role in this, I think, is very fundamental. And one thing to say is that, we talk about how it's hard to get things done in the American political context, especially with polarization. The system has a strong status quo bias. But I think we sometimes don't note enough that really the polarization has been driven by the growing extremism of the Republican Party. So this is just DW nominate scores, which are often used to judge the left or right position of politicians. And these are just House Democrats and House Republicans who are outside the kind of middle ground on these scores. And basically what's happened is the Republican Party has gotten massively more extreme. And this is true in the Senate as well. And so when we talk about polarization, we have to recognize we have a polarization that's driven by the growing conservatism of the Republican Party. And this party coalition is, and by the way, this holds in comparative perspective as well. I don't have over time slides, but if you look at party manifestos, as has been done by some comparative scholars, you can see that the Democratic Party is like a center-left party, more center than left. And the Republican Party is a party that's closer to some of the extreme right-wing parties on a left-right scale. So this is really important, right? So the Republican Party's move from the center has meant that it's both hard to get things done and that the center of gravity in American politics has shifted pretty dramatically to the right, even though Americans haven't. And the result is that, surprisingly, perhaps, Republicans pursue policies that are just not very popular, at least on health and with regard to health and social policy. Exhibit A and B is the GOP 2017 agenda, right, which consisted essentially of two items: the tax reform bill and the healthcare bill, which are, according to this wonderful chart made by Chris Warshaw, the two least popular pieces of legislation in the modern age since the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. So, and by the way, the point that I want to really make is that these policies really express essentially the position of the economic elite, as Doug Massey was saying. But are not actually popular even among Republican voters. And politicians aren't just are not supposed to pursue policies that are just so far from the center. These are like unicorns. And in 2017, Republicans managed to create two unicorns at once. So they actually didn't get one of those unicorns through the Congress, the healthcare bill, but it was a close thing. And it's just worth remembering that that bill was both unpopular and would have devastated many of the communities that voted for Republicans. And so what explains this? And as I said, it's a kind of story of plutocratic populism. And here's where I think the kind of focus on the demand side tends to underestimate the effect that this bundling, which is a party strategy, can generate the kind of racialized outrage that we see so often in contemporary politics. And it's not something that just relies on politicians, right? There's an enormous infrastructure and sort of outrage, an outsourcing of outrage, if you will, that which involves right-wing media, the Christian Right, National Rifle Association. And so on the one hand, you have those groups getting people to the polls and getting energized. And on the other hand, you have these plutocratic organizations, the Koch Network, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, American Legislative Exchange Council, whose goal mainly is to try to get favorable policies at any level of government that they can. And so, Daniel Ziblatt has written about this conservative dilemma, and when inequality is rising, the conservative parties have to figure out how to continue to get less affluent voters to vote for them or abandon the rich. And the Republicans haven't abandoned the rich. But one thing he says that I think is really important is that there's a real attraction to trying to rig the system so you can stay in power without having to win over voters. And fortunately for Republicans, the system's already pretty well rigged in their favor. And that's where I want to just make sure I mention, we haven't really talked about America's peculiar institutions, but we have a system that has an enormous anti-metro bias. Our single member districts, territorial elections, in the House, in the Senate, right, the system is essentially set up to represent low population areas more than high population areas. But in the House, the single member district structure, as you all know, has meant that Republicans have been very effectively been able to cram Democratic voters together in urban areas. And so place matters a lot, as Doug Massey was saying, but I think part of it is thinking about how place is grafted onto the structure of our political institutions. So I don't want to leave you guys, I want to end, but I don't want to leave you guys despairing. And so I just want to say just a word, since we've talked about all of these problems, about what the prospects for change are, because obviously we're having a huge debate play out right now about how to respond to these challenges. And it's clear the Democratic Party has come to think that addressing insecurity is a fundamental part of pushing back against this plutocratic populist coalition and bringing positive changes to American households that have become so insecure. And I just want to just say as a closing is that I think it's really important to see this not as sort of a fight over messages in which, you know, it's all about winning over the median voter in the electorate. There's huge imbalances of power here, and that's why the plutocratic side of the plutocratic populist coalition gets to decide so much of what the policy stances of the Republican Party are. And the system is really tilted, and so I think we really should take seriously the idea that it's going to take long-term political reform as well as measures to address economic inequality and insecurity to bring the system back into some fair balance. And I would only say two things here. One is that there are opportunities that are due to the fact that we're so unequal, right? Modest tax increases on the rich, if they could be enacted, could fund really substantial investments in the non-rich. But the other thing to say is just that Democrats obviously need to think very seriously about how they're going to change the structure of the system, not just through political reform, but also through policies that can reshape the political landscape over time. And this quote from Jerry Taylor, formerly of the right, now head of a center-right organization called the Niskanen Center, I think says it all, right? Democrats really need to learn how to mix some concrete themselves. All right, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I think now for the questions, I'm going to ask everybody to turn their cameras on so we can answer the questions and have a discussion as a panel. So one of the first questions that's come up is related to what Jacob was just talking about, but I think it relates also to some of the others, particularly Kris-Stella, which is how does symbolic politics play into the bundle of plutocracy and populism? And, you know, is politics about representation of interests, or is it about preferences, and where does symbolism and symbolic politics operate?
Since you mentioned me, I can go first, and others can also weigh in. Yeah, I think it plays in strongly. So in the kind of presentation that I gave, I think the place where symbolic politics kind of touches on what I was talking about is at this point where I was talking about how stereotypes and perceptions of social groups matter, right? So there's a lot of symbolic politics going on in people's perceptions of what the rich are like or what the poor are like. And so those representations, we are very used to thinking about stereotypes of the poor as being racialized in the United States. And I think that is a correct and important way to think about it. And I think there's also symbolic politics going on with the rich, you know, starting in your garage, college dropout, job creator, like those kinds of things are also symbolic politics. And so as long as those symbols are very powerful, that, in my opinion, is an important reason for why this kind of dry quantitative numbers, that type of interventions don't, you know, information interventions aren't as effective, don't really lead to opinion change, which may also be why we've seen such a muted response, because merely changes in inequality may not budge those symbols, right? Maybe those symbols move through other political means, and we need to look at what could budge those, and that's where I would look. So I think it's a great connection to make.
Thank you. I was just noticing on Let Them Eat Tweets, the picture that they have on that book is a picture of a, you know, kind of a 1920s type of rich guy with a top hat, etc., holding money in his hand. And it does raise the question of where are our modern, what are the modern vilifications of the rich that are symbols, and why aren't we coming up with them? Why isn't that part of the debate? So all you graphic artists out there, there might be some opportunity for you to introduce some new visuals here. Thank you. Did anybody else want to answer this question about symbolism?
Well, in my talk, I spoke about physical separation between people, but that's what's really changed is that's highly reinforced by separation in the virtual sphere on the internet. The segregation that occurs in real life probably pales in comparison to the segregation on the internet, where people, we know how the algorithms are working now. They work to intensify emotion, taking people into extremes. If you don't come into contact with anybody that doesn't share your opinion on things, you're not going to change your opinion. And what the internet has proved to be is a massive reinforcement machine for already held prejudices that only intensifies them over time and defeats the purpose of face-to-face contact, defeats the way that people come together in the real world.
So it just presents a challenge for how you actually begin to attack this. You could get people living closer to one another. I was going to ask you about California's movement, which is a step forward to allowing more density and getting rid of some of those density restrictions. And, to what extent would it begin to change some of the things that you talk about?
I think it would change a lot of things, but Californians are not very open to higher levels of density. One of the great ironies is that it's a great liberal state, but it doesn't want to deal with one of the biggest problems that we've got, which is unaffordability of housing and segregation because of the not in my backyard syndrome.
Right. And I guess the question is whether these small steps that they've taken towards allowing people to build accessory dwelling units in the backyard will do anything. It may increase density, and will it do anything to challenge the fundamental picture that you painted with your data of people so separate from one another spatially? It'll
chip away at it, along with these voucher programs that seem to have an effect, but it's really they're marginal effects compared to the overall structure of American society.
Right. Chipping away, I think, is an appropriate way to put it. Let's see, we have a few other questions. One of them was answered by Andreas, but I'll let the answer be shared, or let the question and answer be shared with everyone. So this question is, in terms of policy responses, Andreas Wiedemann mentions the difference between social investment, such as education, versus social protection, such as unemployment and sickness insurance. Are there other kinds of direct regulatory changes, such as tax reform or zoning changes, that would accomplish more towards reducing inequality? So Andreas, I'll let you answer that one, so directed at you.
Yeah, I basically said that, on the tax reform front, I mean, there are a couple of taxes, tax expenditures that are geared toward the middle class and the high income, such as the mortgage interest deductibility, for example, that I think could be tinkered with to alleviate some of the inequalities that arise because of that. And I think this reminded me just of some of the debates that we were having right now about taxing capital gains or the income of hedge fund managers and so on as capital gains versus as income. I think there could be something to be done. But then, as Doug just mentioned, I think on zoning issues, I mean, that's obviously also a regulatory domain where I think we could open up some of the communities to be more inclusive rather than having zoning basically done as like an exclusionary mechanism where you only have high income communities, which I think give rise to the outcomes that Doug has documented. So I think those are just a few thoughts, but it's obviously clear that, you know, only tinkering with the welfare state in terms of social protection or social investment is not going to do a lot to change inequality. I think we really have to think also about regulatory reform, or even, you know, at the political level, think about our political institutions and how they amplify and then also recreate the inequalities that we see right now.
Thank you, Andreas. I want to read something that Andrew Schank, my colleague at Watson and in sociology, wrote about symbolic politics. And he says, research by people like Seamus Khan and Rachel Sherman suggests that one aspect of being rich and socializing the rich at places like Exeter and St. Paul's, which is what Seamus Khan's book's about, today is the adoption or inculcation of regular guy personae and dress, fleece vests, does that sound familiar? And open collar shirts, etc. And he says it's hard to caricature the rich in pictures when they look like regular folks. I think it's a very, very good point. Wearing black turtlenecks at all. Let's see, I've got another question here, excuse me, about party polarization. I'm sorry. And it is, do you see, excuse me, the asymmetry of party polarization translating into a mass polarization? And this refers, sorry, I have to drink a little water. This refers to the political science literature. It says the affective polarization literature tends towards more symmetrical findings. Is this a measurement issue, or are there some other dynamics at play? So party polarization, is it the same as mass polarization? I don't know who wants to, Jacob, if you want to take a crack at that one.
Yeah, I can take a crack, and I like Andrew's earlier point too. I just want to note that notwithstanding the lack of I guess today's image might be like a Mark Zuckerberg in a hoodie, right? Despite the lack of the resonant cultural symbols of the monopoly era, it does seem as if people are pretty down with taxing the rich, right? So the polling is very clear on this. And of course, I actually want to say a little bit about how we understand polls, but I do think that we really should, one of the things that's become quite manifest in the last few years is that, you know, the idea that, you know, if we raise taxes on the super rich or on corporations, you know, that this would be not just bad for the economy, but politically damaging. It's just completely belied by the survey evidence. The most popular elements of what Biden has tried to do are the most progressive in this regard on the tax side. And that's true in both parties. But I think Chris's question is a good one, and I think the sort of the message that Paul and I came to and let them eat tweets is that we'd understated the degree to which elite polarization was generating essentially mass polarization. And here I think you know, the work of Liliana Mason is very helpful, and the emphasis on kind of effective forms of polarization is very helpful, because it's not a kind of policy content polarization among many voters. It's a kind of distrust of the other side, intense support for allied politicians, increasingly a kind of especially on the right, a kind of anger and resentment toward political elites who are betraying the public, and I think that's a very powerful alchemic. You know, it's a very powerful part of the Republican formula. For Democrats, it's less clear that that's really fundamental to their base of support now, though there are elements of it on the progressive side. I do think one thing we just haven't really talked about, I mentioned it in passing, is the role of right-wing media. So you know, Doug mentioned rightly social media in general and the internet, but if you look at the work that's been done recently on the impact of Fox News alone, it's just really telling that what these sources are doing is, and even more extreme ones, and the sort of very strong kind of misinformation complex on various social media platforms, what they're doing is not necessarily shifting people's kind of views about policy issues, but instead creating a kind of intense outrage against the other party, against political elites. And the difference between the left and the right here, I think, has to do with the fact that there's just a lot more overlap between mainstream media sources, for want of a better term, and those on the left than there is between right-wing media sources and these mainstream sources. So the right-wing ecosystem is just much more likely to kind of develop these really extreme claims and then have them kind of reverberate through the electorate. And I think you just can't understate the impact of that on at least on a subset of Republican voters. And we saw the really deadly consequences of that on January 6th. And so to me, I think Kris is right that there's something more fundamental at the mass level that's going on that I don't think is well captured by our kind of conventional views of left-right divisions in political science.
Great, thank you. We are nearing the end of our time, and I thought I would pose a question. I thought I would pose a question about, Biden, but, I'm very tired of worrying about what's in these different packages and whether they'll pass. So I think the question that I would like to ask as kind of a closing question is, what kind of research do you think is needed to better understand the political and policy context of the United States? What do we need to know to better understand why we have entrenched inequality that seems so difficult to address in policy and difficult to address in terms of building the political organizations, political willpower that would address them? So whoever wants to take a crack at the research question first. I can't see everyone on my, there you are, you just turned up on my screen. So who would like to take a crack at that?
Well, I've always thought that sociologists spend way too much time studying the poor, and they need to spend more time studying the rich because they're the ones that control the levers of power. And I think that that stands now. What I've learned from, not from sociologists, from people like Jane Mayer, who wrote the book Dark Money, and other sources, is that there's just tremendous amount of private money out there in the information systems to create misinformation and disinformation and propagate it. And with the rise of Trumpism, Trump's become a cult of personality, and it's easy to hold a coalition together if all you have to do is praise Trump, and if you don't praise Trump, he'll withdraw his support and criticize you, and you'll be toast in the Republican Party. That holds the coalition together. The Democratic coalition is very diverse, and it's harder to hold together. So the combination of kind of a one-person party, one-person politics, and tremendous amount of money going into creating anger and distrust and ire and resentment towards minorities, towards the elites, especially liberal elites. I think that we really need to pay more attention to how the very wealthy are using their money to stack the deck against everybody else in the country.
Yeah, that's incredibly interesting. And it's true that we have a lot of work on the poor and much less in understanding what the affluent do, where they put their money. You begin to see little pieces of it that journalists have picked up, but there's much less, I think, of political science and sociologists. And I think that work like of that Andrew Schrank was mentioning is is important in that respect because it begins to open up the doors to understanding aspects of the very wealthy today. Anybody else who want to try the what research should be done question?
I can have a go. I'd first say that I think the first idea was excellent and we should do that. And then if we're not going to do that, then mine is like this second suggestion, which is I would love to see more research on how stereotypes change, especially deliberate attempts to change perceptions of groups. This is relevant not only, again, as Doug was pointing out, we have a lot of research on how stereotypes of the poor and especially visible minorities kind of come about and how they get reinforced by political forces. But even in that relatively well-studied area, efforts to mitigate prejudice, essentially prejudice reduction efforts, which are efforts to change stereotypes, are less well studied than you might think at first glance. Even something as well known as the contact hypothesis has not been very well studied in terms of actual interventions that seek to put it into practice. So there's more work to be done there, but more broadly, stereotypes also show up with respect to the rich, as we already discussed. And I think also in this party polarization question and answer that Jacob had with one of the participants, there too, we have these kind of exaggerated stereotypes of the other party that are clearly playing out in a detrimental fashion in our politics right now. What can we do to actually shift those around? Are there ways you can actually intervene in these political processes and kind of stop or reverse or jig them? I think we know very, very little about what that might look like, what might be effective, what can be scaled up, etc. And I would love to see research on that.
I was just going to jump in, Margaret, with a final word, which is just, it's a shameless plug for this volume that Kathy, Paul, and Alex Hurdle-Fernandez have put together with me. And our argument in this volume is that what we need in American politics research is more work that's taking seriously the political economy. That is not just, the sort of standard view of political economy as being, using economic techniques or game theory to study politics, but really thinking about the relationship between capitalism and democracy in the United States, understood in a comparative perspective. And that all of the work that's been talked about fits really comfortably within that, within this larger umbrella. And the phrase that Kathy came up with that I really like is that, we really need to, we pay a lot of attention in American politics research to what you might call in supply chain logistics terms, last mile politics, and we need to pay a lot more attention to kind of the long journey that leads up to last mile, whether it's the way in which beliefs are shaped or the way in which policies play out over time. And so the example that we have in the book that I think really resonates with what's been said so far is that the structure of American political institutions and public policies together are really powerful influences on the range of possibilities as we struggle with these issues today in ways that are both sort of familiar, anti-metro bias of American and status quo bias of American political institutions, and that are pretty unfamiliar, like the way in which our decentralized system of zoning really structures the way in which local politics plays out and the possibilities for addressing a lot of these stark inequalities at the local level, given that we increasingly have, one-party systems in both urban and non-urban settings. So I feel like, just want to say that I feel like the book that you guys put together is a really good example of this kind of new direction of work, and we're hoping to keep pushing it forward. And anybody who wants to join our effort, we're looking for fellow APEers to help reshape the way we study American politics.
Jacob. Anybody else want to weigh in? I guess everybody has except Andreas. I don't know if you want to weigh in. I know you just finished a book, so you need to have everyone read your book.
Yeah, I think I'm, since I'm a comparativist, I'm going to wear my comparativist hat and say that I think we learn a lot about the US by studying other countries as well. And so, to the extent that we want to focus on institutions or the example that Jacob just gave about, zoning regulations, I think it's really, really useful to look at other countries and see how they do zoning, for example, and to what extent that also leads to the same outcomes or different outcomes. And sometimes you don't even have to go to other countries. I mean, you can also compare different states within the United States. I mean, there's a lot of variation in terms of regulations, in terms of institutions and so on. And I think we can learn a lot more about, a particular policy domain or a particular institution by looking at other countries or comparing states. And so the challenge here, of course, is, getting the data, and even beyond data is to make sure that you're actually comparing same and same. And that's a challenge I think that every, comparativist faces, but I think it's a very rewarding process that not just helps us to understand how things work in a comparative perspective, but also how things work in the United States itself.
Great, that's wonderful. That I'll put in a plug for what I think should be researched, which is I totally agree with this question about focusing on the affluent, and that is the focus of the Stone initiative on inequality that we have here at Brown. So the piece of it that I am particularly interested in and have been sort of collecting journalism articles and would like to figure out how to do more scholarly research on is on the role of private equity. And it seems to me private equity has had tremendous impact on American institutions, hospitals, newspapers, things that serve people and are vital to their quality of life, but also things that are vital to the quality of democracy, like newspapers. So that's what I am hoping to take a look at as part of this project. But I think, understanding the affluent, I'm glad that you brought it up, Doug, because I think it's one of the things that research tends to do less. And I see that my co-convener of this initiative is now on screen. So Jim Marone, who is at the Watson Institute but is currently in Paris, and it is very late there. If you just want to say a few words, Jim.
Just to thank you. This was really just fascinating and a great start to our initiative. I was thinking for the students listening in, there is a kind of dark pessimism that falls when you start to talk about inequality that you've done very little to dispel. So let me just toss a flyer. I've been racking my brain if there's anything to say positive at the end of this. And I wonder if the experience of the ACA, of the Obamacare, might not be a little straw in a win for something better. There's legislation passed in the face of terrific racial animosity, and one that begins to move social benefits a little bit. Andreas, nowhere near what you were showing on your slide, but still a little bit out of the employment system, and one that did, I think, Jacob knows more about this than I do, but that did buffer a little bit of the insecurity during this great downturn by protecting people just a little bit more. So in all this very penetrating pessimism that you've presented us with, I wonder if we don't have one thing maybe to learn lessons from that we might be deployed in the future. So that's my vain attempt to take a positive note at the end of our talk, but really wonderful presentations and lovely chapters in the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jim, for interjecting that something positive. And I will say the ACA it's getting the foot in the door, and that might be what the Biden administration is able to do. No big new deal, but a few more foots in the door that make a difference. So thank you all for a wonderful panel. I so appreciate your participation, very fascinating. And we will look forward to seeing you in some form or another, in person or virtually. So good night.